Now, you, for instance, what are you doing sitting here, old man? Nicanor Ivanovich was directly addressed by a fat cook with a raspberry-colored neck, as he offered him a bowl in which a lone cabbage leaf floated in some liquid. I don't have any. I don't. I don't. Nicanor Ivanovich cried out in a terrible voice. You understand, I don't. You don't? The cook bellowed in a menacing bass. You don't? He asked in a tender woman's voice. You don't, he murmured soothingly, turning into the nurse Praskovya Fyodorovna. She was gently shaking Nicanor Ivanovich by the shoulder as he moaned in his sleep. Then the cooks melted away, and the theater with its curtain broke up. Through his tears, Nicanor Ivanovich made out his room in the hospital and two people in white coats, who were by no means casual cooks getting at people with their advice, but the doctor and that same Praskovya Fyodorovna, who was holding not a bowl but a little dish covered with gauze, with a syringe lying on it. What is all this? Nicanor Ivanovich said bitterly, as they were giving him the injection. I don't have any and that's that. Let Pushkin turn over his currency for them. I don't have any. No, you don't, the kind-hearted Praskovya Fyodorovna soothed him, and if you don't, there's no more to be said. After the injection, Nicanor Ivanovich felt better and fell asleep without any dreams. But, thanks to his cries, alarm was communicated to room 120, where the patient woke up and began looking for his head, and to room 118, where the unknown master became restless and wrung his hands in anguish, looking at the moon, remembering the last bitter autumn night of his life, a strip of light under the basement door, and uncurled hair. From room 118, the alarm flew by way of the balcony to Ivan, and he woke up and began to weep. But the doctor quickly calmed all these anxious, sorrowing heads, and they began to fall asleep. Ivan was the last to become oblivious, as dawn was already breaking over the river. After the medicine, which suffused his whole body, calm came like a wave and covered him. His body grew lighter, his head basked in the warm wind of reverie. He fell asleep, and the last waking thing he heard was the pre-dawn chirping of birds in the woods. But they soon fell silent, and he began dreaming that the sun was already going down over Bald Mountain, and the mountain was cordoned off by a double cordon. Chapter 16. The Execution. The sun was already going down over Bald Mountain, and the mountain was cordoned off by a double cordon. The cavalry ala that had cut across the procurator's path around noon came trotting up to the Hebron gate of the city. Its way had already been prepared. The infantry of the Cappadocian cohort had pushed the conglomeration of people, mules and camels to the sides, and the ala, trotting and raising white columns of dust in the sky, came to an intersection where two roads met, the south road leading to Bethlehem, and the northwest road to Jaffa. The ala raced down the northwest road. The same Cappadocians were strung out along the sides of the road, and in good time had driven to the sides of it all the caravans hastening to the feast in Yerushalayim. Crowds of pilgrims stood behind the Cappadocians, having abandoned their temporary striped tents, pitched right on the grass. Going on for about a half mile, the ala caught up with the second cohort of the Lightning Legion and, having covered another half mile, was the first to reach the foot of Bald Mountain. Here they dismounted. The commander broke the ala up into squads, and they cordoned off the whole foot of the small hill, leaving open only the way up from the Jaffa road. After some time, the ala was joined at the hill by the second cohort, which climbed one level higher and also encircled the hill in a wreath. Finally the century under the command of Mark Ratslayer arrived. It went stretched out in files along the sides of the road, and between these files, convoyed by the secret guard, the three condemned men rode in a cart, white boards hanging around their necks with robber and rebel written on each of them in two languages, Aramaic and Greek. The cart with the condemned men was followed by others laden with freshly hewn posts with crosspieces, ropes, shovels, buckets and axes. Six executioners rode in these carts. They were followed on horseback by the centurion Mark, the chief of the temple guard of Yerushalayim, and that same hooded man with whom Pilate had had a momentary meeting in a darkened room of the palace. A file of soldiers brought up the rear of the procession, and behind it walked about 2,000 of the curious, undaunted by the infernal heat and wishing to be present at the interesting spectacle. The curious from the city were now joined by the curious from among the pilgrims, who were admitted without hindrance to the tail of the procession. Under the shrill cries of the heralds who accompanied the column and cried aloud what Pilate had cried out at around noon, the procession drew itself up Bald Mountain. The Allah admitted everyone to the second level, but the 2nd century let only those connected with the execution go further up, and then, maneuvering quickly, spread the crowd around the entire hill, so that people found themselves between the cordons of infantry above and cavalry below. Now they could watch the execution through the sparse line of the infantry. And so, more than 3 hours had gone by since the procession climbed the mountain, and the sun was already going down over Bald Mountain, but the heat was still unbearable, and the soldiers in both cordons suffered from it, grew weary with boredom, and cursed the 3 robbers in their hearts, sincerely wishing them the speediest death. The little commander of the Allah, his brow moist and the back of his white shirt dark with sweat, having placed himself at the foot of the hill by the open passage, went over to the leather bucket of the first squad every now and then, scooped handfuls of water from it, drank and wetted his turban. Somewhat relieved by that, he would step away and again begin pacing back and forth on the dusty road leading to the top. His long sword slapped against his laced leather boot. The commander wished to give his cavalrymen an example of endurance, but, pitying his soldiers, he allowed them to stick their spears pyramid-like in the ground and throw their white cloaks over them. Under these tents, the Syrians hid from the merciless sun. The buckets were quickly emptied, and cavalrymen from different squads took turns going to fetch water in the gully below the hill, where in the thin shade of spindly mulberries a muddy brook was living out its last days in the devilish heat. There, too, catching the unsteady shade, stood the bored horse handlers, holding the quieted horses. The weariness of the soldiers and the abuse they aimed at the robbers were understandable. The procurator's apprehensions concerning the disorders that might occur at the time of the execution in the city of Yerushalayim, so hated by him, fortunately were not borne out. And when the 4th hour of the execution came, there was, contrary to all expectations, not a single person left between the 2 files, the infantry above and the cavalry below. The sun had scorched the crowd and driven it back to Yerushalayim. Beyond the file of 2 Roman centuries there were only 2 dogs that belonged to no one knew whom and had for some reason ended up on the hill. But the heat got to them, too, and they lay down with their tongues hanging out, panting and paying no attention to the green-backed lizards, the only beings not afraid of the sun, darting among the scorching stones and some sort of big-thorned plants that crept on the ground. No one attempted to rescue the condemned men either in Yerushalayim itself, flooded with troops, or here on the cordoned-off hill, and the crowd went back to the city, for indeed there was absolutely nothing interesting in this execution, while there in the city preparations were underway for the great feast of Passover, which was to begin that evening. The Roman infantry on the second level suffered still more than the cavalry. The only thing the centurion Ratslayer allowed his soldiers was to take off their helmets and cover their heads with white headbands dipped in water, but he kept them standing, and with their spears in their hands.